Right, like I expect the noise, but it's still so daunting. Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for picking me. It's like speed dating, but for conferences. And I'll try my best to make it worth your while. Firstly, can everyone hear me? Right. Cracking. Excellent. So, as Katie very kindly just said, my name is Beth Joss-Pothen. I am an assistant curate in my third year in the Diocese of Chelmsford in Harlow, and I'm here today to present very briefly on climate refugees, racism, and the church. It should go without saying that this will be by no means kind of a complete exploration of this topic, but I hope it's enough to kind of get you going towards thinking about change in your communities, amongst your loved ones, and kind of looking further into this specific area of climate justice that's often overlooked in your own reading and in your own prayer life. So I'm going to begin by unpacking the very large question of what is climate migration. So there are a few different terms around for describing people who move either within their home countries or to other places due to factors in the environment. So the term climate refugee, which you saw on my description, is sometimes used. There are also terms such as forced climate migrant or climate displaced people or persons. There are very kind of intense semantic and legal arguments about kind of why one term ought to be used over another, which we do not have time to go into at this moment, but they are interesting discussions which have led to kind of this impasse. And the main consequence of that impasse is that such people who are defined by the fact that they are forced to leave their place of residence is that they have no legal protection. So this movement can take place after a one-off event known as a climate event. So most likely an incident of extreme weather, so a flood, a drought, a storm, a fire, or slower climate processes such as a depletion of food, desertification, water scarcity, or consistently failing agriculture that leads with no other option. So as I said, this impasse has led to the fact that regardless of classification, these people and groups of people have no legal status or protection that is specific to their status of having to leave their homes because of the climate. So unless they additionally meet their receiving country or countries' definition of an asylum seeker, which many do not because there isn't kind of an active, in a lot of cases, persecution involved, they fall through the cracks of pretty much every country's immigration system. So the lack of a law protecting them means that no country is actually kind of compelled to take responsibility or to kind of demonstrate any level of compassion for their plights. So these people kind of go through huge amounts completely unprotected, and by the time they get anywhere, resources are depleted, if not kind of completely exhausted in terms of money. And they may well be suffering from kind of very complex and varied traumas associated with the loss of one's home, the loss of one's livelihood, the loss of loved ones, and the fact that for many people being separated from their land, whether that's the land they cultivate or the land they grow up in, is, as Frantz Fanon writes about kind of quite extensively, is an act of violence. So there are numerous very complicated and very emotional factors at play. And this is not a far off problem. It is already happening to people in different parts of the world. So in January 2020, there was a massive case that was brought to the UN by a family from Kiribati, which is down near New Zealand, who had originally sought refuge in New Zealand, citing that the rising sea levels resulting in failing crops and the lack of access to fresh water meant that remaining in Kiribati was a threat to their lives. One member of their family had contracted blood poisoning from drinking contaminated water, and they were returned to Kiribati by the government of New Zealand since they could not adequately prove that the climate was a threat to their lives in the immediate. But the notable thing about that case was that two judges who heard the case vocally dissented to the outcome, comparing the actions of the New Zealand government to forcing a drowning person back into a sinking vessel just because other people happened to be on board. In Bangladesh, there has been a 15-year trend of its poorest population, who mainly live in the Delta region in the south of the country, having to leave their homes altogether due to flooding, and the increased salinity of the water being such that it destroys their crops and their abilities to fish and provide. The monsoon season, which they expect every year, is arriving earlier and earlier. And that means, and the kind of increased rainfall that's coming with it means that thousands of people have moved to cities, which are already overstretched and not adequately infrastructured. In Mozambique, the cyclones Kenneth and Idai, I apologize if I've butchered that pronunciation, hitting within a month of each other in 2019, led to over 300,000 people being internally displaced. Those who were able and had the means to leave Mozambique faced the fact that Tanzania and Kenya, which are the nearest countries, were facing drought and failing agriculture and desertification. And so it goes on rather relentlessly. So the recent floods that we saw, like only last week in Germany and Belgium, pictured third just there. The heat wave in the Pacific Northwest last month, with some of America and Canada recording previously unseen temperatures. Last year's wildfires in Australia destroyed 18.6 million hectares of land. The cold snap in Texas earlier this year, which people were completely unprepared for, and left people scrambling of ways to protect themselves and their loved ones, which resulted in the deaths of over 200 people. And I use those latest examples, those last four, which are in front of you, to highlight an issue in climate migration and in climate damage that we see quite a lot when climate change affects the Western Hemisphere specifically. And that's known as the fallacy of disbelief, which essentially means the closer something is to home for us and the wealthier the place it affects, the more that we are shocked and disturbed and astounded that such a thing is happening at all. And this is conflated by media attention being increased and headlines being more sympathetic than they are otherwise, than if the damage and catastrophe had happened elsewhere in the global south. So for some places, we accept that these things are simply kind of part of life, but for some places it's sad and a tragedy. This isn't, of course, to say that these occurrences aren't all sad, but more to point out the discrepancy in reporting. And this disbelief is a form of racism in reporting, which we will get onto later. But it's also further proof that we expect wealth in the West to act as an insulator, and we use it as a means of injecting distance between ourselves and our comfortable lives and the effects of climate change. These events are all the result of climate change, and they will all have consequences in displacing people, either through homes or livelihoods being destroyed beyond repair, or through residents deciding that the risks of it happening again are not worth living with. These displacements could be temporary or they could be permanent. It's likely that as people move and as patterns emerge, we won't actually know for some time. We must consider the fact that climate change, in whatever manifestation it arrives in, are threat multipliers and exacerbators. So they heighten existing conflicts, existing problems with food and water supplies, existing agricultural problems, existing sanitation problems, and existing threats of violence and missed education as resources become scarcer. So they compound everything. Whatever problems are already occurring are heightened and made worse. This brings us on to how many people it is likely to affect. I don't know why there's a random circle there. The World Bank in 2018 released a study which focused on three regions: Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, and found that without tangible climate action, more than 143 million people in just these three areas will be forced to move to escape the impacts of climate change by 2050. More than 1 billion people worldwide will live in countries with insufficient infrastructure to withstand climate change itself. These estimates, by many people's kind of opinions, are actually conservative, and given how speedily and unpredictably things have moved already in environment and climate science, there may well be more factors that we haven't yet accounted for and that could actually magnify those numbers. The causality between an economic or social pull towards a better life elsewhere and environmental push to leave is difficult to fully know, because human motivations are, after all, kind of complex and multifaceted. But the fact remains that the places that these enormous changes are going to take place in most quickly are the places with the least infrastructure, with the fewest resources to tackle any given crisis, the greatest risks of disease spreading through poor housing and water sanitation. So these disasters will be inflicted on those who have done the least to contribute to Earth's warming, and some of the most marginalized and disenfranchised and discriminated against people in the world, and to whom the greatest violence has already been done through the West's imperialism and greed and exploitation of natural resources. So it's pretty bleak, and not to say there isn't any hope, but you're in the wrong chat for that in a way, although some does come at the end. And it doesn't get much better when we think about how the UK is serving its current refugees and what that will look like in the future. So the government of this country have made it abundantly clear that they wish to make seeking refuge or claiming asylum as brutal and as bureaucratic and as difficult as possible. The Nationality and Borders Act, which passed yesterday, is accumulation of this absurd level of cruelty. It will make, I wrote this in the past tense, kind of hopefully, it will make arriving in the UK by any means other than directly from the country you lived in before illegal and punishable by prison time, while simultaneously adding to the blocks that refugees and migrants have had in place for years. It would also grant the government permission to use offshore processing centres in countries as far away as Rwanda. Those who are already settled here have no recourse to public funds and are not permitted to work until their claim is processed, with many people waiting up to 5 years. They receive £36.95 a week per person, which has to cover everything that isn't housing or bills. So that's food, phone bills, transport, clothing, nappies, toiletries, prescriptions, everything. Many people, particularly those who travel without children to reunite with family, are housed in unsafe accommodations, such as those seen at the Napier Barracks in Kent, which are the photos on the screen. Despite what any extremely haphazard and fumbled report tries to make us believe, there is significant racism and xenophobia present in the UK. The attitude of the government and the media towards refugees and migrants has magnified, particularly since the Brexit campaigns, which saw UKIP and that man run on an explicitly racist agenda and using increasingly degrading language, including swarms and invading, accompanying pictures of people seeking safety. The government's ineptitude and deliberate ousting of those who came over during the Windrush generation have been another such example of how people can experience unwelcome after many years of settled life, paying taxes, and in many cases working for the NHS, which continues to serve us through a pandemic. The agenda in this is clear. It is to portray people who are fleeing misery, terror, and hardship that few of us can even imagine, let alone will go through, as dangerous and hostile. They are criminalising seeking a better life. The pictures we are broadcast give little to no indication of any individual's humanity or capabilities, what they have seen or gone through to make that journey. They only exist to instill fear of the other. We saw not 2 weeks ago, in the wake of the Euros, the horrific racist abuse of 3 young England players, Jadon Sancho, Bukayo Saka and Marcus Rashford, who collectively have done more for society than many in high office, and in many ways encapsulate a lot of the hostility and very precarious situations that people of colour, particularly those born elsewhere, face. That is that their welcome only extends if they are serving the desires of white British people, and they have to smile, go above and beyond, and not complain about racism or discrimination, lest the retort be, as so many have been, well, if you don't like it, go elsewhere. So what can we do as churches and as Christians? Firstly, we can pray, that most accessible and free of all activities and ventures. Pray for those seeking refuge, for those who cannot leave, and those who have already been lost to many a perilous and violent journey. So if you are a person who has the great calling and responsibility to pray publicly, Bring these issues to your congregation or group. Pray actively against racism and white supremacy and xenophobia. There is a lot of power in simply naming issues for what they are in public prayer. Be prepared for some people not to like it very much, but persevere. Find out what charities and organisations operate near you and join in. Offer your space, your time, your money, your expertise if you have any. If you are a business or know a business, what can be donated? Encourage people you know to volunteer and publicise the charities in your churches or community spaces or online. Make them your charity of the month if you do such a thing. Give tithings. Invite people who use the charity to a meal or an event. If you are aware that English is a second or third language, print materials in the first language to encourage a sense of welcome. Churches up and down the country are involved in this work. Churches historically have done this work, as well as some gaping gaps that we should all be ashamed of where we have failed to welcome. We have a duty and responsibility as Christians to do it in whatever capacity we are able to. If you are a person who has opportunities to preach or to write, why not do it? Explicitly speak about climate migration or the loss of Indigenous lands and livelihoods. Draw parallels between the injustices of the immigration system, racism, and biblical persecution. We do the Bible a great disservice if we pretend it has nothing to say on this particular topic, when it most assuredly does. Our command to take care of the land, of the refugee, of the stranger, to honour the foreigner in our midst, and to recognise the dignity of God in every human being is biblically mandated, from Exodus to Paul wrecking his ship in Malta and getting rescued. We have countless saints, ancient and modern, who have devoted their entire lives to this work. It matters because we know that in doing so, we serve Christ, who incidentally was a refugee child of colour. As with the prayers, some people, I can guarantee you, will not like this either. Trust me, I've done the legwork. But it is always, always worth provoking the conversation and reminding people that the Christian faith is not necessarily supposed to be comfortable. We can take steps corporately and personally to mitigate climate change damage itself. Campaigning and organising put pressure on your denomination or workplace to divest from fossil fuels if they haven't already. Church of England. Make changes to your habits and the habits of your churches, some tips for which I'm sure you've picked up over the course of today and will do so tomorrow. We can all actively challenge racist and homophobic and xenophobic, but also homophobic, I just misread it, rhetoric when we hear it. We can keep up with the news around immigration and around climate migration and injustice, even and especially when it's hard to hear, which it absolutely can be. We can all take the time to educate ourselves however we learn best, whether that's discussion with others, Instagram pages, books, films, podcasts, some recommendations for which I will put on the next page. These can give us the tools to challenge where we might find it difficult. And remember that no one person's discomfort, fragility, or defensiveness is equivalent or comparable to someone else suffering on account of racism. Any ability to switch off and divest from discussions around the climate and around this injustice, even to believe it isn't real, is based on privilege, pure and simple. Where we are all born, and ergo the effect of climate migration and change on our life is a complete lottery, with absolutely nothing to do with moral superiority or a right to a better quality of life. Most of all, we must remember that we don't actually get to bequeath humanity as we see fit based on anything, not on a person's acceptability to us or how good serving them makes us feel. We don't get to bequeath it based on how a person left one country and entered another, or what they had to do to survive in between. Not on whether we speak the same language or whether they look like us. Humanity is ultimately bestowed by God, who has given everyone full human dignity, regardless of anything else that stands in the way. thank you for listening. I'm going to put some resources up and look at the questions, although I've just realised I can't do both. Ugh, that's annoying.
If I was going to help with the questions, if you want to leave the resource list up, I thought I'd...
Okay, that's fine then, just, yeah, read them to
one
me.
from Justin, which is asking what your view on civil disobedience is, with the example of rehousing illegal climate refugees in or through churches.
Knock yourself out, yeah, if it's safe to do so for you. I mean, I think everyone in terms of civil disobedience has to work out where they're comfortable, what they're comfortable putting on the line, particularly if, you know, you end up going to prison and there are people who rely on you. But yeah, I think it's an individual decision. I think there, as the great John Lewis said, there's always room for getting into good trouble. And if it doesn't, it kind of boils down to, if not you, who. And, you know, that fantastic quote from Isaiah, which is, "Here I am, send me," which I think ultimately informs, you know, what I would like to think I would do. And I think a lot of the time as well with these things, it's kind of feel the fear and do it anyway. So yeah, I hope that's helpful. That was very vague.
Great encouragement. And there are some people asking if you could put the slide back up.
Yes, I shall. Slides. Come back, slides. There we go.
And or if they were easy to copy into the chat, you could put them in there and then people could access the text.
There we go.
I don't know how easy that would be for you, Beth.
I can just upload the PowerPoint, I think. I'm not precious about the copyright of it because it's honestly not that good as a PowerPoint. So how do I do that? Stop share? Stop share, there we go. Chat, everyone. I'll just put it in here because you can attach files, can't you? Are there any other questions?
I mean, I think there was one about, and actually, Charles, we are about to run out of time, so it's up to Beth as to whether or not she wants to stay for a minute longer, but about, and you might need to help me understand this, Charles, but about the role of governance within making cities sustainable. Is that cities that people come to or cities that people leave from?
Sorry.
So we're looking mainly at cities perhaps of 150,000 people, say in northern Ghana, somewhere like that. These are cities which are expected to have very rapid population growth. And it's the issue promoted by the University of Groningen is that the best solution to make them sustainable is to improve governance. And I wondered what Beth's view of this was.
I mean, ultimately, the dream would be that places that people are fleeing from because of corruption or violence at the hands of their governments would be improved to the point where staying was viable. But as I think I touched on, a lot of this is exacerbated. So even if we took care of, even if, you know, the governance side of things was taken care of, we still would have the climate change issue. Now, if you have a decent government, obviously the hope is that some of that would be mitigated. I think as well.
Sorry, it's about adaptation rather than mitigation.
Sorry?
It's about adaptation rather than mitigation.
I think the hope is that I think the governance would be of a sufficiently good quality that they would manage to adapt to climate change. But I don't know enough about the kind of the governance of various African countries to comment as to whether that is viable in the time that we have left to mitigate kind of these things snowballing.
Thank you, Beth. I think that, yeah, I think that's a fair
I'm having a trouble kind of sharing the presentation. So I will put my email in the chat. And if anyone wants it, I'm happy to email it.
Amazing. Oh, thank you so much. I'm sure there's quite a few people that are going to do that because that was a really good looking resource. Beth, I don't know how to thank you enough, really. That was a compelling kind of tour through a really really big topic, and I think you spoke with a lot of passion and knowledge, so I really appreciate that. I realise I'm still recording, which makes me feel very self-conscious.